Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll take you into the dark tunnel of building components with generic types. Why, you ask?
Why?
Because we want to be able to use them over and over again with different objects. That's why. Without generic types, there would be no third-party market for Blazor components. Yes, I'd like a custom data grid for the customer object, please. You see, any component that you want to reuse with any kind of object must be written with generic types, and that means reflection. System reflection is a namespace in .NET that lets you deal with types. Every object has a getType method that returns a type object. You can inspect the properties of that type, and you can read and write property values. Yes, reflection is the key to generic types, and that's what we're talking about right now, right here on Blazor Train. Okay, I'm starting with a Blazor server application called Generic Component Demo. To the shared folder, I'm going to add a new Razor component called Generic Component. So as I said before, generic components are those where the types are passed in and inferred, and then the component can use reflection to work on the properties of that type, or methods, whatever. But reflection is the key. Now, for any component that needs to accept a type, you can use this little directive right here, type param t item. Now, I've got actually a component filled out here, so let's take a look at that. So the type param can be named anything, but this is your type. This is how you're going to refer to the type of the object that you're working with. So in this case, the only UI is this display message read-only property. We'll get to that in a sec, but take a look at the rest of this. Here's a parameter that exposes the item itself. It's a public property of tItem. So whatever you're passing in, this becomes a parameter. This is the object that you're going to be working with. Now, in order to use reflection, we need the names of the properties that we're going to be working with. In this case, I have a text property name, which is just a string, and a value property name, also a string. Now, this is just a simple demo that displays a string based on what this object is. So the first thing we need to do is get a type object from tItem. So you could also use item.getType to return a type, but this is just another way to do it. So now we're going to get the name from that type object. So the name is the name of the type. We're going to create a person class, and that's what we're going to bring in here in a minute. So this name should be person. And then we're going to get the text property. So from a type, you can call getProperty and pass the property name. And there's all sorts of options for this. But this is going to get the property info object for this property. And property info is one of those reflection classes that helps you get and set values and examine other things about the property, attributes, for example. So next we're going to read the value of that property by using getValue, passing in item, because item, if you remember, is the item that we're working with. So this is saying get this item's property that's named this. And it's a string. We're hoping it's a string. And that gets returned into text. So far we have the name of the object person, and we have the text property name, whatever that is, and the value of that property. Now the value of the text property shouldn't be confused with the value of the value property. The value property, think of like an ID, a primary key, that kind of thing. So this would be a unique value for each object. And so we're doing the same thing here for the value property. We get the property info object, and then we pull the value out of that. And we also make sure that it's a string. And here's the string we're going to display. The name objects, like the person objects, value property name, which is going to be ID, value is, and then the value of that ID property, and its text property name, which is going to be name, its name value is whatever that thing is. So now let's just hijack our index razor to work with it. Here we go. We've defined a generic component. You say tItem is the class person. The item itself is test person. Look, we've got a test person here. Here's our person with an ID and a name property. And when we initialize, we create that new person with an ID of 42 and the name Carl Franklin. The text property name is name. That's what we're going to display. And the value property name is ID. So let's see what happens here. And there you have it. The person object's ID value is 42, and its name, it's. The person object's ID value is 42, and its name value is Carl Franklin. Ta-da! All right, so that's just the basics of how to use that type param in a generic component. Let's expand this a little bit. Let's add some properties so that we can get the text and the value and set the text and the value, because after all, this is Blazor and we want to be able to bind these things to UI elements. So I added this item name property, which is just read-only, returns the name of the type person. Here's a generic text property handler. So for the get, we're going to get the item type property of the text property name, value of the item object to string. And if we're setting it, we say item get type, get property, text property name, set value of this object and the value that's passed in. And for the value, I've made an assumption that it's an integer. So my get takes the value that the same method that I got the text property name, but I'm going to get the value property name and convert the whole thing to an int32 because get value returns an object. All right, set value is going to be exactly the same as it is in our text property name. This time it's an int. And there you have it. So now that we have these generic property handlers that can both get and set values, let's add a little markup that's a little more interesting than just display message. So you can see I've got a style here and I'm using the CSS grid rather than a table, mixing it up a little bit. And here's an editor for this object. Now remember, item name is going to return person. So we've got two rows. In the first row, we have a left column that is actually called grid right item because grid right item is aligned right. Grid left item is aligned left. So here I've got value property name colon, and then I actually have an input tag bound to the value property. So it does two-way binding. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to say you should never allow your users to edit primary keys. This is just a demo. So yes, I know you'd never do this, but I wanted to demonstrate both an integer value and a string value. But there you go. This is the component. And the component now contains this header, person editor, and it has two fields. One where you can edit the ID and another where you can edit the name. Now, how do we know anything has changed? Well, that's a good point. Let's add an event callback. So this is an event handler called updated event callback. And let's actually call that or raise the event in the setters of both the text and the value property. Updated.invokeAsync. So now anytime the value changes or the text changes, we're invoking this event callback. Now back in index razor, we just need to handle it. So here's updated, which is the event callback, equals person updated. This is now going to fire anytime those values change. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint here and we can take a look at our test person. Tab off it. Person updated fires. Look at test person. And look, the ID is now 4211. All right, now let's change the name. Tab off it. Test person now. Name has changed. So there you go. Now that's the basics of generic components, but obviously it can get way more complex depending on what you do with reflection and how far you want to take it. So let's go to the next level, which is a generic object picker UI that uses a generic type. So this is a Blazor server application called Object Picker Demo. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a NuGet package right here, which happens to be something I wrote, and it's called appvnext.objectpicker. So if you go back to the components episode, I show you how to package up a Blazor component and then publish it to NuGet. That's exactly what I did here. I'll show you the code, but first let me show you how to use it. We're going to add to _imports Razor using appvnext.objectpicker, and the demo itself is pretty simple. So again, we have a person class with an ID and a name, and on initialized, we're creating a new list of person, which is all people, and we're adding 4 people to it. Isidore Jar, Mike Easter, Ben Drinkin, and Pico Bendropov. Now I've also got this list here, selected people, and that we just initialized to a new list of person. So now I've got this little demo using my object picker. I've set the all items parameter to all people and the selected items parameter to selected people. The item type plural is people. If the object were called customer, this would be customers. It's not used for reflection at all. It's just for UI. But, you can't assume that the plural of person is persons. Nope, it's actually people. Now I have my text property name, my value property name, I have my T item, and we even have a component updated event callback. And that's what we're doing right here. We're handling it and saying, setting the display message, which is a string, to selected, and then how many people are selected. And we're just displaying that there. Now you've probably done UI like this. If you're like me and you've been around a long time, you've probably done this in many, many different formats. Maybe Visual Basic, maybe Access, maybe Windows Forms, maybe React or Vue or Angular or even Knockout. So this is a common UI pattern here where you have a list of items or objects on the left identified by the particular property, and then on the right the ones that you select, and you can simply double click on one to move it from one side to the other. And you can see selected is 2 here. Now it's 3. I can move all from one side to the other. I can click. I can use the buttons, right? So there's logic going on here in terms of how the buttons are enabled or disabled depending on what's going on here. And also there's logic that says, you know what? If you send in selected people with one of the people in all people, then I'm going to remove that from the list on the left. The other thing that I wanted to do is not touch my master list. All people is something that I use in my app. So if Object Picker removes a person from all people, they're no longer in my app, right? I just want to pull out the selected items. So let's take a look at how Object Picker works. So here I have it, appvnext Object Picker on GitHub. And taking a look at, first of all, the Razor file. Here's my type param T item. And I've got a table, right, with 3 columns. This is saying what the item type plural is, all people, right, selected people. And then in the left column, I have a select, like a list box, right? I'm handling double click, and I'm also handling on change. And then I go through each item in all items, and I set an option. And if it is my selected item, I use the selected attribute. Now in the middle is where I have all my buttons. Add selected item, add all items, and I also have to have a disabled Boolean. Add selected item button disabled. Remove selected item button disabled. But you can always add all items and remove all items, even if they're already added or removed. Next, on the right-hand side, it's the same idea, except that I'm going through selected items. So now let's look at the code. This is code behind here. Partial class object picker of T item. Here are our parameters. All items, selected items, our event callback, component updated, and then the things that I use internally. A selected item, all items private. Remember I told you we don't want to touch all items. We don't want to mess with that. And then I have my Booleans. Now, rather than have properties, I have basically an item value method and an item text method. And you can see that over here in the Razor file. If at item value of item equals at item value of selected item, blah, blah, blah. So I'm getting the item value and the item text with those methods. Just a different way to do it. Now on parameters set, I'm copying all items to an array, to list, and making a new list from it. When you do to array, you're actually copying the values to a new array. And from that, I'm making a list out of it. So from now on, all items private is what I'm using. So this little piece of code right here removes the items that exist in selected items. Because here's what I can do. I can say selected people add all people 0. And I can add one of these to selected people. And then when it runs, Isadora Jar is not going to be in all people, right? She's over here. So that's what that code does. And the rest of this is just dealing with button states and adding and removing. So it's fairly simple. Now I'm going to demonstrate something that I found online. And I haven't talked to the author. He hasn't responded yet. But it's pretty cool and it's worth showing. And if I'm lucky, we'll get the author of this code on to Blazor Train soon as a guest. But I just want to show you what it does first. Okay, this is a brand new Blazor server project called Generic Edit Form Demo. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a new item group with a package. I'm going to take a guess and say it's Mezientau, ASP.NET Core Components. Mezientau is the author's nickname. So we'll get to this in a minute, but I just want to show you how easy it is. Add a NuGet package, add to imports Razor, a few using statements. We need his ASP.NET Core Components namespace, but we also need System Component Model data annotations and System Component Model because this is a generic form editor. Look at this. So I learned about this guy and his code from a Bing search, and I landed on this blog post right here. Automatically generate a form from an object in Blazor. Now this blog post is long and there's a lot of code, but let's just look at this demo to see how dramatic it is. So you know how edit forms work in Blazor. It's very simple. This does validation. If you go back and look at the validation episode, we have an edit form. This is all Blazor. The model is my model, which is defined here. So the equivalent of the person project. The data annotations validator says, validate against the annotations in the model. And that's where we're going to set up some rules. For example, min length 3. That attribute effectively says this string value property has to be at least 3 characters long. Otherwise, it's not valid and it won't pass validation. The validation summary is just text, and it just shows a message, hey, this has to be 3 characters or whatever. So now here's the generic form. So we're binding to the model. We have the editor class. This is just CSS. So this is everything right here, field template. So for each field in this class, in this model, we're going to show this little div. And we have a label, and we have the editor template for the field and a field validation template. So this basically is going to be displayed for each type. And then I have a button. When we click it, it just refreshes the page. And we show my model toString, which is going to have all the properties. So when we click this, all the properties will update. So what he's done here is he's just created, one of every kind of property. So here's a string value. This is his nickname, Mizianto. A custom name, and this is his actual name, Gerald Beret, I'm thinking, or Gerald Beret. Sorry if I butchered your name there. So then he's got different data types, and these annotations are right from System Component Model data annotations. Like, he hasn't made any of them up, I don't think. So this one is a date, this one is a date time. And what I mean by that is they're both date times, but this one is being constrained to the date without the time. So it'll just show a calendar and not a editor for the time. It's got booleans, integers of all types, singles, doubles, decimals, and this one is not visible in the form because there's no setter. This one is not visible in the form. He's showing you how to use the editable data annotation, set it to false, so it's not editable. So here's a text area. Here's an email, a password, multi-line text, phone number, URL. So with this model and this markup, he's got a complete editor form. So here you go. Now remember, that has to be 3 characters. Look at this. Boom. As soon as I jump off, the field string value with custom name must be a string or array type with a minimum length of 3. And here's a custom name. So here's the date, constrained to a date. Here's the date time. That also has this nice time picker. Here's a boolean, which is checkbox, all manner of ints. And what happens if I put text in here? Oh, I can't put text in there. That's great. And that's longer than an int 16. I bet that's why that's yelling at me if I go up here. So this right here is showing you all the details. I'm not going to get into the meat of this component right here because I just discovered it and I don't really know anything about it internally except from what I've read on GitHub. And it's pretty complex. I encourage you to check it out. And as I said, maybe we can get Gerald to come on the show and talk about it. But that should get you started. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. Well, I hope you took a big bite of generic components, and I hope it tasted good. It's got to taste better than the coffee that's been cooking in the cafe car since Portland. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail.